Hello, and welcome to Letchworth State Park. My name is Elijah. I'm an environmental educator here in the park. Those of you that are familiar with Letchworth might recognize this gorge behind me. This magnificent gorge helps to make Letchworth State Park a very popular place. You might be familiar with one of the park's many nicknames, the Grand Canyon of the East. What you might not realize, however, is that Letchworth State Park comprises over 14,000 acres of land. That's a lot of space that this park takes up. There's plenty more to Letchworth State Park than just the gorge. So for today, we're going to leave the gorge behind and we're going to take a walk through the woods to learn about what we call forest ecology. When we say ecology, it sounds like a big fancy sciencey word. What we're actually talking about is the interconnectedness or the relationship between living things in an environment. Ecology also studies how living and non-living things interact in that same environment. When we're looking into a forest and thinking about the kinds of things that live there, many of you might be thinking about trees, which is great. A forest is defined as a landscape that's dominated by trees. You might be familiar with some of the other living things you can find in our forests, the squirrels, the deer, the flowers, and the ferns. What a lot of people might not be thinking about when they think about a forest ecosystem or the environment in a forest is how important those non-living factors are. Believe it or not, but rocks are very important to our forest. The dirt or the soil is extremely important. The sun, even the wind blowing through the forest can play a crucial role. Forests here in Letchworth State Park, as well as forests all over the world, are all a little bit different, and each individual forest themselves can all change over time. The forest that we're standing in right now has not always been a forest. In fact, less than 100 years ago, this was all wide open farmland. And we can still see evidence of the farms that used to be here when we find these old hedgerows. You may have noticed this row of trees beside me here growing in almost a straight line. All of these trees in the hedgerow are about the same size, we assume about the same age, and this old hedgerow of trees would have acted as a boundary line for the farms that were here. Eventually, the state park took this land over. This open farmland was allowed to regrow into forest, and whenever that happens, we can predict which trees will show up in which order, thanks to something called forest succession. If you follow me over here, I want to show you what we call a pioneer tree species. When a forest is growing, you can get a sense of the approximate age of that forest just by looking at the different trees that are most common. In a younger forest, you'll find many, many pioneer tree species like this white birch tree, sometimes called a paper birch because of the papery bark all over its trunk. Pioneer trees like this white birch love wide open sunlight areas. They cannot tolerate shade. Their job as a pioneer tree species is to grow as tall as possible, as quickly as they can, to release a lot of wind-blown seeds to spread out over that open area and help the forest continue to grow. Eventually, these pioneer tree species will be shaded out by their taller neighbors and they will die. To the untrained eye, areas of the forest with a lot of fallen birch trees or other pioneer tree species might look like an unhealthy forest, but that's just a sign that the forest is getting older. A forest that's dominated in other kinds of trees, like this sugar maple tree over here, could be considered older forests. Trees like this sugar maple are what we call climax tree species, a forest that's dominated by big climax tree species we assume are older forests than ones dominated by pioneer tree species. Taking a look at this sugar maple tree in particular, it's not very big. It's maybe this big around, but it's not too wild to think that this sugar maple tree is at least 20 years old or older. As a climax tree species, it doesn't mind hanging out low in the forest in the shade of its taller neighbors, waiting for those taller trees to fall, which will open up a gap of sunlight in the forest canopy, the roof of the forest, which will allow this sugar maple and its younger sugar maple brethren to grow up nice and tall and start to dominate this forest themselves. The fallen, dead, or dying trees that we find in a forest are not a sign of an unhealthy forest. They might just be a sign of the forest getting older, and those dead and dying trees themselves still play an important role to our forest. And if you follow me down the trail this way, we'll see a really good example of that. So we found here a big old tree that looks to be at the end of its life. And using a couple of clues, we can figure out what kind of tree this is. First, its bark is very smooth and it's a light gray color, and its leaves are oval shaped with a point at one end, and the edges are covered in teeny tiny what look like teeth. These leaves also look and kind of feel like paper. And those clues help to tell us that this is a big old American beech tree. Right now, this tree is being rotted away from the inside out. There are different fungi and bacteria, animals like ants that are chewing away, eating the wood, decomposing it, and breaking it down to make more soil for the forest. And to some hikers walking by this tree, it might look a little ugly to have this standing, dying tree in a pristine woods. But when we take a look inside, we can see why this beech tree is still playing a very important role in the forest. Inside of this beech tree, we can see the entire center has rotted away. Think of all of the animals like bats that can roost inside of this tree, or possums or squirrels or raccoons that can find shelter from storms in this big old beech tree. So while it may look a little unsightly, this beech tree, though it is dying, is still very important to our forest. So let's take a walk further down the trail and see more forest interactions. As you might remember, the science of ecology includes studying how different living things interact with each other, and we call those interactions symbiosis. Maybe you've heard that word before, maybe you haven't, but if we break it down, the beginning of that word sym means together or with, and biosis means a way of living. So putting them together, symbiosis is the way that living plants and animals live with each other. There are three main kinds of symbiosis that we'll cover together. The first one is what we call mutualism. In a mutualistic relationship, both living things that are interacting with each other get some kind of a benefit. A really great example of mutualism in our forests is something called lichen. When you look at the bark of this beech tree here, it may look like this tree is sick. You might notice some blotchy colors here. But this blotchiness is actually a living thing we call lichen. Lichen is actually two living things that have come together, joined forces to create this lichen. One half of lichen is an algae, which is a kind of plant. Plants can use sunlight to make their own food. Photosynthesis might sound familiar to you. But algae oftentimes need something solid to live on. They can't normally exist just on their own. So they team up with their buddy, a fungus. Think of mushrooms. Fungus is something solid enough to live on its own. It can collect its own nutrients, but it can't create its own food the way that photosynthesizing plants can. So the fungus allows the algae a solid surface to live on, and that algae provides the fungus with some food after photosynthesizing. So together, they create this lichen, a mutualistic relationship where both the algae and the fungus get some kind of a benefit from this relationship. But not every example of symbiosis benefits both species involved. Let's head down the trail a little bit further and we'll see an example of that. In our forests, there are lots of different kinds of mushrooms. Different mushrooms have different jobs in the forest, and some of them, like this mushroom right here, have a mutualistic relationship with our trees. The trees are photosynthesizing, making their own food, and underground, around the roots of these trees, the tree and the mushroom team up and they're sharing resources. They're sharing food and other nutrients. But there is another kind of symbiosis that's happening underground here in our forests. An example is right over here. This odd-looking plant is actually a wildflower. It's not green because this plant does not photosynthesize. It is a parasite. This, what we call ghost flower, has a parasitic relationship underground at the place where the mushroom and the tree meet by the tree's roots. While the tree is photosynthesizing and sharing nutrients with the mushroom, this ghost flower plant is sucking out some of that food and some of those nutrients and taking it all for its own. This is a parasitic relationship because this flower is getting a benefit, but the tree might be losing out on some nutrients from the mushroom. As we take a further walk down the forest floor trail, we're going to see one more example of symbiosis. Take a look at all of the holes in this big old tree trunk. When you think of what kind of animal could have made these holes, maybe one of the first things to come to mind is a woodpecker. And that's exactly right. What we're looking at is the work of a pileated woodpecker. Happens to be North America's largest woodpecker. A big woodpecker, as you can imagine, makes really big holes in trees. Pileated woodpeckers' favorite food are carpenter ants. So in a dead or dying tree trunk, the carpenter ants are making these mazy tunnels. The pileated woodpecker comes along and makes these long, narrow holes in the trees. They're following the alleyways left by the ants so that they can gobble them all up. This pileated woodpecker isn't going to use these holes forever, so when they leave, we see another kind of symbiotic relationship, something we call commensalism. In that kind of a symbiotic relationship, one species gets a benefit while the other is unaffected. The unaffected species in a commensalistic relationship is the pileated woodpecker that is going about its business, pecking these large holes, these large cavities in trees to get to the ants. That's just a part of their life. That's something they do. That's something they're always going to do. The relationship they have while making these holes is with eastern screech owls and some other birds that are cavity nesters. They nest in holes in trees, but they can't actually make those holes themselves. So when the woodpeckers are pecking away and making these deep holes, these deep cavities in the trees, and then they leave, screech owls and other birds now can come in and are benefited by having all these places to build their nest. Here in Letchworth State Park, we have a lot of pileated woodpeckers pecking big holes into these big old trees, and that helps out our screech owl population. The more screech owls we have in the park, the more they're able to control rodents and other possible pests that might get into our cabins or into your campsite the next time you're camping here in Letchworth State Park. We have a great history of these big old trees living and growing and being planted here in the park. And let's go find out a little bit more of that legacy left by William Prior Letchworth. When William Prior Letchworth first came to this area in the 1850s, he found a place that was almost completely deforested. Humans had been chopping down as many trees as they could for decades, even centuries before Mr. Letchworth showed up. So when he made this place his home, he made it one of his goals to bring back nature and bring back natural beauty to this area. One way he did that was by planting lots and lots of trees. We estimate that William Prior Letchworth planted about 10,000 trees on his property while he was living here. After his death in 1910, the American Scenic and Historic Preservation Society was fulfilling one of Mr. Letchworth's wishes when they started an arboretum project. This sign beside me here indicates one of several dozens of arboretum blocks that were planted throughout Letchworth State Park. Blocks of trees were planted in this public park to bring back more nature and natural beauty. Continuing further ahead to the 1930s, when the Civilian Conservation Corps was in the park, building our cabins, roadways, many of the stone walls and picnic shelters that visitors enjoy today, they were also planting lots and lots of trees, keeping in consistent with the conservation part of their name. Red pine trees were by far the most common species of tree that they planted in our park, and you can still find a lot of those red pine tree plantations here in the park when you visit today. Thank you so much for joining today. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions about our forests here in the park. And remember, any little thing you do, like removing litter, helping to remove invasive species, or even planting some trees around where you live, just like we do in Letchworth State Park, can help your forests too.